Well, good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking out time from your schedule and being with us today. My name is Karan Sachdev and I'm the Managing Director for HNI India. And I will be moderating today's discussion around workplace strategy in COVID. We are in unprecedented times and the current situation has really challenged our normal way of working. Every day you hear a new perspective that creates more questions than clarity. Take for example, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, just yesterday was making a case for expansion of offices post-pandemic. While on the other hand, one of the largest Indian IT companies, TCS, has claimed that by 2025, only 25% of their workforce will be required to be in office. We tried to answer some of the questions during our last webinar session that we hosted a couple of weeks back. It had some of the well-known industry personalities as they spoke about new norm in the workplace designs post-COVID. It was interesting to learn how different stakeholders perceive the current situation will play out. But for today's discussion, we'll be working on a different format. We will be bringing to you how HNI's workplace strategy team, through its research and study, believes how workplace strategy will change due to the current pandemic. Well, let me make it clear that we do not have all the answers, but we will try and stay abreast of what is happening and try to bring it to you in a clear and concise way. Just like our previous webinar session, we have included some polling in the presentation and encourage you to vote on those questions. You can also ask a question in the chat box and we will try and get those as well as, time permitting. Our panelists today who are joining us from the US, early morning for them, Jan Johnson and Pam Keefe. Jan is the Vice President and Head of Workplace Strategy at HNI. Jan is a dedicated researcher and skilled practitioner who just completed a nationwide tour in the US for her most recent body of collaborative research, Unwritten Rules. Pam Keefe is the Vice President of HNI in Asia Pacific. Pam joined HNI in 2014, although she has been servicing clients in US and APAC for many years before. Pam is passionate about client-focused solutions, and although she's based in Singapore, she's also joining us from US today. Welcome both of you. Just for the record, we'll be recording today's discussions. Over to you, Jan.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I apologize if you hear some thunder in the background. It's actually a very stormy morning. And so you may hear some of that background noise. As was said, we don't pretend to have all the answers at all. We're watching, as you are, how everything changes almost daily. And even some things I read a few weeks ago that were published in early April now sound really dated because we've learned so much in the meantime. So this is a bit of a journey. We're all on it together. We have a lot to learn as we go. There's things we're going to try that may be great and other things that may not be so great. I think we're all going to figure it out, but I think this notion of us continuing to talk to each other is super valuable so that we can share those best practices and those learnings and keep us all up to date as best we can. So our commitment is to do that. Pam, if you go ahead and advance, I think I want to sort of start with this quote from a designer in the States, but particularly the second sentence is, I think, her point about us being part of the solution is really great. It gives me a sense of inspiration and purpose that I can use my design training and my design thinking skills to help think through some of these things, to analyze the things I'm hearing and to begin to formulate some ideas that are worth testing around how this could work for us. And I think it also emphasizes our humanity, that it's important that we stay in touch with each other and spend time talking to each other and even consoling each other in some cases, because this is a really stressful situation, even though we're all being good soldiers and continuing on. We're also going to take just a second to point out that we've brought forward some ideas here around macro trends about how the world is changing, but even some of these now seem slightly dated and can vary from country to country depending on what our solution is to the current pandemic. But I think there's a couple that are interesting. Pam is in New Hampshire because she can't get back to Singapore just yet. So there's the temporary end of global travel. I'm personally just curious about the introduction of telemedicine. It's something we need desperately in the US. But the one that I think is the most relevant to today's discussion is this notion of both physical and psychological safety. That it may be that people who are, for very good reasons, leery of coming back to the office and exposing themselves to greater exposure may keep our initial return work levels low. So I think that's something we have to think about and perhaps be prepared to support, because again, this affects everybody quite differently. And it's an important thing that we show that sense of empathy, because this is a very stressful situation. So we're going to cover 3 topics today. We're going to talk a bit more about people, and therefore we're calling it user needs and experiences. We'll talk a bit about spatial effectiveness. What are we actually thinking is going on inside the office? And this notion of distributed work, which you maybe have called agile work or remote work, but we'll talk a little bit more about that and think both in terms of responding to the current situation, but also what the opportunities are for us to think about that in the future. And then we'll share some quick resources and tell you about where you can find other things from us. So I apologize in advance. This is a really busy slide. It doesn't look like it at the moment, but it'll be a build and you'll see. I am biased to bring a lot of attention or a lot of information to the slide itself, because I want to, as I see this later, be reminded of what all we covered and see it there instead of having to go back to memory. I'm a visual, so the visual information is super helpful to me to really make sure I get it. And so bear with me, this will be the worst slide in the deck, and then it'll be sort of downhill in terms of how quickly we can go through it. But I'm going to basically show you 2 parallel paths that are horizontal. The user needs and experiences are sort of above the arrows, and the spatial effectiveness is below. And we're going to talk a bit about the key questions to ask and potentially some key activities to do. So in the first tranche, which is under identify goals and challenges, that's sort of the beginning of the process. We know each country is a bit different, and even different cities are at different points in starting to think about returning to work. We see a huge range of where the states are in the US and et cetera. And I know China is ahead of the game, but you know, there's going to be a step function strategy to this. And I think each organization needs to think about how it's approaching it. The big question to me under user needs and experiences will be, you know, how do we help them feel safe coming back to the office? What does safe look like for them? What kinds of things are they concerned about? Is it possible then to set up a cross-functional task force as an action item to be able to identify a cross-section of people, to let them share their concerns, to kind of test certain things about what do they need to hear or understand to feel like the right things have been done? And then how do we create a communication plan that could include various medias, because not everybody has the same access to information as everyone else. For example, a lot of our factory workers don't have email. And so how do we make sure we're communicating with them effectively so they're just as aware of what's going on as those that do? And then at the bottom, you know, who's working when and where is who are we bringing back? Who are the most essential employees that absolutely have to be in that first wave? Why are they coming back to the office? And do we have to do things like staggered shifts or other sorts of accommodations? For example, not having everybody show up at the same time, because the entrance to the building may not be able to support that. We don't want people congregating. So how do we again think through all the strategies that would be appropriate to make sure that people feel like they're going to find safe conditions in the process of getting there and once they're there. In the second tranche under analyze needs, now we're talking a little more specifically about what is it that the office is definitely going to have to support as people come back. We have to sort of think through both, how is our work going to change a bit because of this distancing issue? Will we use our collaborative spaces as much, but have to make accommodations for that? Or will we find ourselves doing a bit less of those face-to-face things and spending more time communicating with the people who have not yet returned to the office? So that could cause, that second example could cause acoustical issues, because now everybody's on video all day long and generating noise for each other. So I think there's a lot we need to understand about what the nature of the activities that will happen in the office and how we go about supporting them. And again, what I said earlier about expecting that some of our workers may come to us and ask for some even greater schedule flexibility, or to not be included in that first batch because of concerns about their own safety or the safety of their families. And then at the bottom, it's just a little bit more comments about the space itself. You know, if organizations who have not previously had remote work as part of their strategy have been sort of thrust into the metaphor of the deep end of the pool, is the organization going to have those things as part of the capabilities of the office, so that again the office can effectively communicate to the folks that haven't come back yet? When we start to think about translating into solutions, what behaviors and protocols could build resiliency? I mean, I think there's a lot of question these days about whether or not once the pandemic is over, we're going to revert back to exactly how it was before the pandemic. But what is it that we're going to learn in the course of the pandemic about being able to then, if there's another one in a few years, to immediately know kind of some of the solutions that have worked in the past already and be prepared to continue to sort of morph and adapt as things change? And then how about the spaces themselves? We'll spend a little more time on this one, but how do we determine what we believe to be the right social distancing and support that both with the seating arrangements and the circulation flows, so that we make sure that people passing through spaces aren't, you know, brushing too closely to other people? What about, again, the use of some of the technology in the shared spaces? And what about finishes? We'll spend a few minutes talking about that too in a bit, about being able to withstand consistent and probably a lot more aggressive cleaning than ever before. So how do we think about that? Under implementation, as we begin to actually put these things in fact and have people come to the office, how do we welcome them with transparency and trust? How do we hold orientation sessions? Again, hopefully we've been communicating even before they showed up to know what we're doing and how it's going to be and what sorts of behaviors are going to be needed for them to follow to keep everybody else safe. How are we communicating those changes? The more they feel as though the company has a handle on what's going on, the organization has a handle on this, the more trust will build in both directions. As workers know what to do, management is comfortable that they will follow the protocols that have been established, et cetera, and that they're sort of working for everybody. And then a question about implementation as it pertains to space. You know, how do we know what needs to change? And then as we get to an adaptation, that may seem like an odd word to have here, but it's meant to say, as we're implementing, hopefully we're making adjustments as we learn, but adaptation is more future focused. How do we set ourselves up to understand what we had to do to respond to the pandemic and to this sort of gradual coming back to work? How does that teach us about how the space may want to be built out so that it has the flexibility of reverting to some of those safety features if and when something like this happens again? We know we're going to all be sensitive to that. We might as well acknowledge it and sort of build it into our program, but we're social creatures. We are not going to want to keep this distance from each other, this physical distance, any longer than we have to. But how do we then adapt when the time comes if something else like this happens, so that we can go back to the things that we know will carry us through? And so how do we think about that in advance? How do we plan space so that we can evolve it over time? And that's good for our organizations anyway, because we're constantly changing as institutions, as organizations. So how do we build that into the way we think about both space and planning? All right, you were all very patient. Thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break here to give you a poll question you see on the screen and see if there's any particular questions that have come up just in the last few minutes.
Yeah, so as you know, I highly encourage all the attendees to please answer these poll questions. In the meantime, I'm going to take up one question here for Jan and Pam. What suggestions do you have for those of the people in areas where their employers don't see these changes as urgent? You know, how can, they're asking how can they help see the employer that how important this is? What's your thought around that?
Well, I in a perfect world, we would be good communicators and we could express ourselves somewhat freely and be able to voice opinions and make sure people heard us, but that's not always reality. But I think to some extent, each organization and each person in that organization sort of has to understand the culture of the organization and potentially pick some ways that make it more likely to be heard. But I suspect that numbers matter too. And I'm not suggesting that there's a mutiny or any of those sorts of things. I'm not going nearly that far, but I'm saying I think it's helpful that if management understands that there's a groundswell of concern about an issue, and that there may be solutions that are suggested along with stating the problem, that there may be a way through this. I think it's us as humans sometimes get paralyzed when we don't really know how to respond. And so if the workers can help think through this and formulate some recommendations about what they think might be a way forward that seems consistent with what the organization can probably, abide, then maybe that's a way to kind of get them from what could be just paralysis because it's so intimidating. So I think you'll have to sort of assess what the situation is yourselves and what's going on with management and what might be, again, something that can be heard by them. But I'm sorry that that's the case for you, because I'm sure that's an additional layer of stress that is just making it even more challenging.
And I think there's another side to that coin, is that as leaders and organizations and managers should be checking in with the staff and employees to uncover where they may be uncomfortable and to make sure that they're solving those issues that make them help them to feel more comfortable and safe to go back to work. So I think it's also the part of management to be checking in with the employees and uncovering those things that people may not, automatically feel comfortable bringing up.
Yeah. And I suppose one other thing is if they as managers feel like they don't have enough information, there's a ton of it swimming around right now. And granted, it's tough sometimes to make sense of it all, but if there's anything that we or some of the colleagues in CRE organizations or other places where there's been, a lot of development of materials, I think there are certainly a lot of resources that could be helpful.
Right. All right, Rahul, do we have the results? Interesting. Bit split in the first question. I think, where is your organization in its preparation to open up your offices? I think majority says we're just starting to think through the challenges. And a third of that think we have a team in place working. So good. So I think things are sort of being worked on as companies start to come back and open their offices. On the second one, what kind of concerns have you heard workers express? Majority here, 60% and up, staying safe overall, not bringing virus home. Can I just work from home? Take it.
Yeah.
And I personally, I think that's a reasonable assumption. I'm feeling the same way. Is if the office is going to come with such constraints, and I'm concerned about whether or not we've got our act together, I would also be somewhat reluctant to come back.
Sure. Let's move on.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about user needs and experiences, not to belabor it too much, but just a few things to point out is we've created this pyramid. And for those of you that might have heard of Maslow, I think he might have either been a Brit or an American, I forget. But anyway, he came up with this model several years back that has to do with this premise that people need their needs met in kind of a predictable sequence. The basics have to be first. If I have no food or shelter or access to water, I'm going to be really preoccupied with that because it means my survival. And once those needs are met, I can start thinking about other things. And so I think in this case, the metaphor is apt that people are concerned about their personal and psychological safety, and those are going to come first. And those organizations that don't address those appropriately will find that productivity is challenged and other things may not work as well as they are because people are preoccupied with those very basic concerns. So it's really important that we face them and face up to them and do something about them. And some examples of that, Pam, I think if you hit the next advance, we'll see some examples of the things that could help with that personal safety. So clearly, as we've said before, concise communication. What are we doing? What is it intended to help solve? Does everybody feel like it's doing that? What kinds of new cleaning standards with even visual reminders might be possible? What are we doing about elevators and access to the building and the staggered shifts and the staggered entrances and things like that? Pam's going to talk a little bit about actual go back to the office protocols. And then do we have the right plans in place in terms of the actual physical workplace? On the second level, this is really about reassuring people again that there are guidelines and policies, that we've listened to the science, we sort of know what to do, we've got the best ideas at this point, but we're also willing to adapt them if we find that they aren't yet fully as robust as they need to be. So there might be, again, formal, remote, and flexible work policies. We could be talking again about feedback loops, which we are big on, training around all the things that we're talking about here and the way we plan on using the office in the short term. And again, assessments of what's working and not working. We've got to be willing to change on a dime if we find that something just isn't happening the way it should, and figuring out why and doing something about it. And that's another way to build trust. So it's a good thing for us to be willing to do. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, you know, this notion again of being seen and being heard, that the culture is one of trying to make sure that well-being and communication are our top priority, that all that does reinforce the sense of belonging and mutual responsibility to each other, that again engenders trust, which continues to drive the organization forward. And again, an ongoing assessment of just how we're doing and how people are experiencing it. So this is really all about making sure we're in touch with people, we're listening, we're responding, we're earning their trust by clear communication and a willingness to admit when we don't have all the answers, and to continue to try to improve on what we've done so far. We gave you a couple examples here of just some of the things that we mentioned in each category. This is sort of from the hospitality industry, and is a great way to say, look, this desk you're going to be sitting at, or that table in the cafe, has been cleaned in the last 15 minutes. It's safe to sit down because we've you know, disinfected from the last user of that space, for example. So what kinds of cues can we give people? At the second tranche, it might be an orientation plan to the way the floor plan has had to change. Any sort of circulation patterns that now need to be followed. So, you know, can we have even arrows that express when we've had to turn some aisles into one ways, like you might see in grocery stores these days. We're doing that here in the States. And then finally at the top, an example of surveys, of other ways to, it doesn't have to be a formal survey, but what are the sort of pulse surveys that keep us understanding where people's heads are at? Quick example, we had a client who was doing a good job of that. They were asking their entire population every morning one question. But what they finally figured out after a few days of this is they hadn't started to play it back to the employees. The employees were giving them a lot of information, but nothing was coming back to the employees about what management was doing with their results. So we've really got to make sure this is a two-way street and that there's communication going in both directions.
So thanks, Anne. As many of you know, HNI India has one of the largest office furniture manufacturing plants in India. It is a 350,000 square feet state-of-the-art facility with all the machinery, standards, and processes that are specified by HNI US. As a trusted market leader, when you decide to reopen your facility, be it your plant or your sales offices, during such a time, there is only one protocol that governs all that you do, and that is safety for all our members and our community. And that is how we reopened our plant last week under strict adherence to central and local authority guidelines. Before we called our workforce, we made sure all our members are fit and healthy. We made them sign a self-declaration or an affidavit form, you know, where we asked them if they've not visited any affected areas, or, you know, they've not been exposed to virus in any way. And after opening the facility, we're doing a number of things to ensure everyone is operating in a safe environment. You know, we've built markers at the entry and inside our shop floors to ensure proper social distancing. Before the workers enter the facility and during the day, they are checked for temperature, and we follow a very stringent sanitization process. There is sanitization of all incoming material. So there are a number of other steps that we've taken, and I encourage you to go to our HNI India LinkedIn page, where we have put out a video a few days back that showcases all the steps we've taken to reopen the plant. And that sort of corroborates what Jan has spoken about, that we're doing to sustain a healthy working environment. You know, I'm proud to report that we're the only, you know, only very few plants in Nagpur, and we are one of them, who've really followed such a robust process which was also appreciated by local authorities when they visited our plant post reopening.
Thank you. So we have another poll question and can also take a question from the audience at this point.
Yeah. So one of the questions that was asked is that, do you see this response to the workplace being permanent? I know, Jan, you've addressed briefly, but if and when a vaccine is developed, will the workplace revert back to our old normal to some extent, or are we seeing this as a permanent situation going forward as well?
I think it's somewhere in the middle between those two. I don't think we'll revert to what we had before exactly, identically, but I don't think we'll also adapt those 6-foot distancing and some of those other protocols. But I think to some extent, we have a flu season here in the US every fall, and these kinds of being more aware of distance and not coming to work when you feel sick and, being careful about washing your hands and all that is just good practice, period. And so I think that and some of the issues around distributed work and this notion of being able to potentially work from home in some cases or do some other things with co-working and the like will be expanded, in my opinion. And I think we have a chance to question what the purpose of the office is, and I'm not suggesting it will go away. As a matter of fact, I'm a huge proponent of thinking it's exactly what we still need because of our need for social interaction. We know that communication face-to-face is so much richer, not just incrementally richer, but geometrically richer than any other form, even this video conference. And so the office still serves a huge purpose, both in terms of enculturation and in that sense of belonging and purpose. But the ritual of going someplace to do that work together, I think, is an important feeling. And so if you think about it as less a place just to do tasks and more in terms of an exchange, a place for exchange, I think that's a really interesting notion. So I think it's going to morph, is my point. It's not going to revert back to exactly what we had. It's not going to revert to permanent pandemic. It'll be some good practices will remain, but will be fundamentally altered by this in some form. I hope that isn't a scary topic.
Interesting. Rahul, do we have the results yet, or? Yep.
Well, not surprising that it's mostly about planning and safe distancing plus housekeeping and disinfecting. That makes a lot of sense.
Good, and we'll talk about a few of those things in the next few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So here we'll go into both social distancing and spatial effectiveness. So we're going to talk about space. And it's weird to quote oneself, but I think it's sort of what we've been discussing is how do we do the things we need to do as a culture and as people with humanistic tendencies for, meeting each other and spending time together, et cetera, when we have to stay 6 feet or more apart. That's going to be a challenge. Clearly, from an occupancy limitations, we're sort of just reminding those of you that are still on the beginning of this process that it's highly likely that you are not going to bring everybody back at once. The notion of distancing just requires, especially in densely packed offices at this point, that we figure out how to keep people working at their own desks in ways that make the right distances between them. And so that's going to mean perhaps staggering or doing every other or every third or something else that just implies that, be careful about thinking through the most essential and thinking about doing this in waves. Slide. Here's an example of what we call an 8-pack times 3, and showing that really you can only seat 2 people in that 8-pack because of the need to keep people 6 feet apart. And we've, in this example, suggested that some of the aisles need to just be one way so people don't have to pass each other, and we can walk past those people that are using those desks in a way that still doesn't get within that 6-foot circle. And the same thing will hold true in shared spaces. We have to think through about which tables and or chairs need to be marked as just not being used at this point in time so that we can keep people, remind them to stay a certain distance apart. I think this is going to be a challenge though. I think the 6-foot distance is going to feel super unnatural. and we're all going to resist that, but we've got to try for our own safety and for those that we're working with. But I'm concerned about some of the fixes that we might come up with being maybe just as bad as the 6-foot problem. I mean, there's been some suggestions, for example, of putting up glass screens so that we can sit on either side of it and maybe only be 2 feet apart. But now we've got a piece of glass between us as we talk, which will feel really weird and artificial. So I think to me, this is one of the biggest challenges, is how in an office where the whole point is to see each other and exchange, we're going to have to dampen that because of this distance issue. You know, if you know anything about human factors, something like 1/3 of that 6 feet, the 4 feet, is more normal for us to stand. And I think obviously in other cultures, India may be one of them, you stand even closer to each other to have conversations. And anything further out creates a very formal feeling to it, which may not be at all what we intend. So I think it's important to keep that in mind and be conscious of it, because I think it could be challenging and stressful. So I just want to make you all aware that that may be one of our greatest challenges in doing this. But you can see, for example, when we've sort of removed some of the chairs and pushed things further apart, and et cetera, and added the planters, that now we've tried to create that distance. We also think a little bit about what could be done in the long term. I said, you know, this is a chance for us to learn and to think about what we do next when we have the opportunity to make change, and think about the size of things and a way we could assume that we can then achieve those kinds of distances in the future if we had to. So if you've got workers sitting at, you know, X size of desk, you know, do we know that 2X equals the distance we would want to keep people away from each other? So if this happens in 4 years from now, we know we can put people at every other desk and they're going to be the right distance apart. The other is the thing that's described at the bottom about mobile boards and planners and things as being tools that help us maintain sort of space division and potentially designate aisles and circulation patterns that help us also know how we should navigate moving through the office, not just sitting in the office. And the same thing will hold true for the next slide, which is mobile pieces. The stuff on the left those are all individual pieces. Each color is a new piece of this loungewear that can be pulled apart and separated so we can create the right distances. And on the other side, where we talk about walls, there's a lot those walls can do for us. We could pull out the wall between the 2 rooms and create one big room if that's what we needed to be able to get 4 or 5 people together with enough distance between them. Or we could subdivide one of them and create 2 private areas where people could get away to get acoustical and visual privacy. So there's lots of things to think about in terms of what do we do next in terms of planning to know that we want to have more future flexibility in our space.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about material and cleaning. One thing we've been researching is the materials that we use to make the furniture with. And we're getting a lot of questions from people about antimicrobial surfaces and materials that we can use on work surfaces and different parts of the furniture. But one thing to understand is that it may not be as effective as we hope. And I'll give you an example. If you spray Scotchgard on your shoes, I don't know if everyone knows what Scotchgard is, but it protects your shoes from water and getting wet, and over time it protects the leather in the shoes. So you spray it on the shoes, it protects the shoe. It doesn't protect the wearer of the shoe from anything. So it's a similar thing if we have an antimicrobial treatment on a work surface. It's actually protecting the work surface and not the user of the work surface. So what's really important is the cleaning protocols as much as the materials that we use, and using materials that are easy to clean. So the shift is more about, you know, cleaning, disinfecting. What are we cleaning with? In our factory in China, we're using sodium hydrochloride to clean everything, and that's in our sprayers. That's in mats as you walk into the facility, and we are also using surfaces that don't have. We try to avoid cracks and crevices where the microbes can live. And another important part about cleaning is to make it accessible and to make it visual. If users need to know that what the surface that they're sitting at has been cleaned, what's been disinfected, what hasn't. If you put the The hand sanitizer, someplace where it's very visual, people know it's there, people are encouraged to use it, having cleaning and wipes handy. We're following CDC guidelines. There's a document from the CDC which we're more than happy to share with you. It's over 700 pages, so just drop us a note or in the chat box if you'd like to get a copy of it. We can send it to you. But it gets into great detail on what are proper protocol for cleaning and disinfecting, and what types of materials and what types of chemicals should you use to clean. We're obviously everyone knows that bleach is really effective in killing the virus, but how healthy is it for the user? So these are things that we need to look at is, what kinds of new and healthy things can we disinfect with that won't cause health issues to the user. One thing we're investigating right now, this is our, on the left-hand side, that's one of our meeting booths, phone booths, and we are putting in UVC lights that would come on when nobody's in the booth. So if you use the booth, let's say you went in there and you did a conference for an hour and then you leave the booth, the idea is the UV light would come on, disinfect the booth so that it's clean for the next user. And we're also seeing use of things like robot disinfector. Similar to a robot vacuum, the robot will go around the floor of the facility with a UV light that shines down onto the floor, killing microbes as it goes through the facility. These robot cleaners are less than $200. So very reasonable in price and easy to access. And we're seeing them used in China now with companies going back to work. All right, we'll stop now for another poll.
So I'm going to take a question here. I think a couple of common questions that are very relevant to what we just discussed on. So how does benching play into the spatial effectiveness? We're also getting a couple of questions that are pretty common. People asking that, in a place where they have smaller offices, is there any strategy, for less space, more employees working, where proximity and, is a real issue?
Yeah, so I think the organizations that have really dense workplaces where people in their daily location are sitting really close to each other are going to have to rethink that all the people that come back. We may have to stagger and have only a third or even a tenth of those people come back so that we can keep those kinds of distances between people. And then as we discover how that's working and what how the pandemic is acting as we come back together, I think we can then make judgments about whether to bring another tenth or another half or whatever it is that we think we can withstand. But I think that distancing thing is a very important consideration that can't be ignored. With regard to sort of small workstations in the first place, that's a cultural norm in some companies and some organizations, right? And so we don't necessarily think we should move to a future where we only have large spaces that already keep us separate, because I think that's countercultural for many organizations and the reality of space usage. But can we come up with workarounds in the meantime to keep people separate? And that's why we're saying that in the short term, not everybody can probably come back to the office so that we can maintain those distances. The same thing is true of the benching question you asked, is we've got to give serious consideration to how we separate or space out people so that maybe at a 6-person bench, only 3 people use it, if they're even still far enough away from each other. And it may be too that we add additional screening in the short term so that people feel as though they're not breathing on each other in some form or fashion. So I think there's those kinds of considerations absolutely have to be part of the discussion. And again, I think there's some good examples that are being circulated by design firms, by furniture manufacturers, by the corporate real estate organizations, commercial real estate organizations. So I think there's some good examples of strategies people are using.
Great. So, what you're saying, it's a new normal. We have to adjust to it. It's a time where there will be less people in the office, and that's a new norm we'll have to follow for the time being. Till
that's right.
More clarity, maybe a vaccine out in the market for all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Good.
Wow, so 61% didn't already have a work from home policy. Wow, this is probably a real shock to your system.
Yes, I'm not shocked, being in India, I know how things are. Not that, companies are not, they don't care or think about their employees, but, I don't think this, people would have really prepared, ahead of time here,
Well,
knowing
sure.
what's what's coming up.
Yes, and forgive me for sweeping generalizations, but you also have um, cultural norms there about extended families and multiple generations living in the same quarters, and there's a certain density to those that make working from home a challenge, and the conditions under the that are in place in the housing. So in the States, we have a little more luxury of more space. We've been space hogs from our infancy. So it's a slightly easier, but please understand too that not every organization was doing this in the US for all this time either. It's these numbers that you have here are only slightly more aggressive in terms of not having any work from home policy is what we see in the States. So we're not really that different in that regard. So I'm not surprised by the response.
And the response to the other question is, I think the organizations are leaving it up to the respective employees to choose, how they want to work remotely, and in terms of the furniture or the environment they want to work in.
Yeah, and again, that's not unusual either.
Yeah.
Although this is an area that I see maybe changing a bit because we're getting a lot of requests from clients right now about what they can do to support their remote workers. It wasn't as big of an issue for them in the past, and it's becoming more of the forefront now. So that could shift.
Yeah, I think you're right. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah. And I was just gonna say, I'm normally a work from home worker, but I do a lot of traveling. But now that I'm not traveling and I'm in my seat every day for 12 or 14 hours, I've even discovered that my own knowledge of ergonomics was somewhat incomplete. And so I think we are going to see that work at home workers really do need support from good ergonomic practices and potentially ergonomic supportive furniture, or we're going to have some issues, because I've already got some myself and I know a lot about this and I've got a pretty decent setup. So yeah, if there's more of that happens for longer durations, we really will have to help people through that and to know how to support them so we don't affect their health.
Which brings us to the next topic.
Exactly. So we're calling it distributed work, even though you might have heard the word agile used. I think that's used a lot in Asia and in Europe to describe the same thing I'm describing here. This notion of being able to be more nomadic, if you will. For me, distributed work is sort of a extension of what we've been calling agile work, of being able to pick the spot in the office that's most conducive to the task I need to do. We've created more spaces for those things to be done, but how do we expand our thoughts about where else people can work when they want to or need to based on the kinds of things they're doing? So what are we learning in this current situation about what works well remotely and what kinds of interactions work well, but what do we have to do to really think this through? So Pam, talk a little bit about your experiences in Asia.
Yeah, it's interesting because here, as you saw in the poll, for many companies, it's the first time people are working from home. And a lot of companies didn't think they could work from home. And we are a really good example of that at HNI. For instance, our manufacturing team in China, when the virus first hit, we had to suddenly enable several hundred people that worked in the office at the factory to work from home, but they didn't have laptops. We needed to work with IT and enable their personal devices for the first time, enable them to access shared folders. So overnight, we had to jump into this, and I'm sure many other companies are in exactly the same situation that we went through. But now we're finding that it can work, and that the sky, the world didn't fall apart because of it, and we actually were able to keep business going very effectively. So we're learning a lot as we go with working from home in Asia, even though it's a bit newer concept here.
So to that end, we've created a few things that may have a little bit of a US bias, but you're welcome to research them and see if they're helpful to you around work from home policies, considerations from a wellness perspective, from ergonomics and other things that help keep people healthy. And also just etiquette of kind of best practices to make it work so that we sort of know how to communicate well with people, how to tell them that we're absolutely open for business and willing to get on a call, you know, having thoughts about when the camera is on and the camera is off, and just things like that that we can sort of work out informally as well as formally. And then for those of you that might be thinking about doing more with this as things progress, there's this sort of a basic big idea around how to think about it. Is it really does evolve around people and what kinds of things they're doing and what sorts of choices you're willing to give them, how the protocols might work, what we owe each other as remote workers. I have to make sure I'm not jeopardizing my team by not being accessible or not getting them the information they need in a timely fashion. And then we have the whole technology issue that's a big enabler of that. So do we have the full breadth of what we need, as Pam said, to let people access files, make sure that they can see messages immediately, that they're accessible to each other. And then obviously it brings up the issue of place. And if we're now talking about both being able to work in the office and at home, can we also make sure we're provisioned to really work anywhere, frankly? So it's not so much that those are our only two options. Can we start to think about other places that might be additional choices we have to work in other ways, as long as, again, we're doing everything we need to do to support our own responsibilities and our colleagues. So I've come up with some questions for those of you that, this may be too soon, but if you want to start to give this some thought, I think these 4 categories are probably good ones. One is, you know, if we start to think about people working from other locations, not that we're all going to rush right over and just do that now, and the office will cease to exist. As I said, I think there's a huge purpose the office serves. But if it's about exchange and not just about doing tasks, you know, how do we think about what the office really needs to be and how we outfit it in the future to be more about those exchanges, and to promote the fact that we do this to physically come together. We need to make sure we're enabling all those kinds of activities. I think the second challenge is a big one, is what about our culture and our management style? You know, there's an awful lot of managers who, not through any bad intentions, tend to assume that, you know, when I can see somebody sitting in front of their computer, I know they're working. And when I can't see them, I don't know they're working. And that creates a sense of maybe mistrust, or whether I'm doing my job as a manager, and that sort of thing. So I think we really have to, that's probably going to be the toughest nut to crack, is all the changes in what we thought were appropriate protocols and management techniques at the same time. And if people are sort of coming and going, you know, how do we still make sure we're in fostering a sense of belonging and support, that they feel like they're a member of the community, that they know how they're connected to the company, et cetera, et cetera. The third is what I think can help answer the second one, which is how do we set up expectations about our responsibilities to each other, and that, again, I can't let my teammates down in any way. I've got to make sure I'm living up to my promises and commitments around timing and the quality of my work, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the last one is, what about the technological things that Pam alluded to, and potentially training around the use of those tools and around some of the protocols we're going to follow about communication.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about some actual applications and furniture, and what you can do, what we can do as we design new offices or work to reconfigure our current offices to make them safer as we bring things back. Obviously, one of the first ideas people can do is add in dividers, whether they're clear glass or other material, to give more privacy around the desk with separations. We're currently looking at translucent acoustic panels, which provide a barrier but allow more natural light to come into the office. But there's lots of things you can do to retrofit your existing office if you do have bench workstations and you want to make them safer. As you're looking forward to the future, though, we're looking at, you know, instead of a long bench, think about putting people more in individual workstations that are separate, with screens around them, giving them and varying the angle of how they're facing, so that people aren't just facing each other and sitting so close side by side. This is what we've done in our headquarters at All Steel in the US. We've on the small round circles, you can see what it was before. So on the left-hand side, we took gallery panels and we wrapped them around. These workstations are along an aisleway. So this is giving protection to the person sitting at the workstation facing the aisleway, and giving them more privacy, more protection to anybody, more comfort for people, because they have people walking past them all the time. And on the right, you can see we put some taller panels as kind of a threshold to go into the workstation. That is giving a signal that this is a private space. Don't necessarily come in here. It's giving the user, a bit more privacy and a bit of a barrier. These are things we just added to existing spaces to retrofit. If you have collaborative spaces with lounge seating in it, you can put in agile screens like this. So these could easily be put in place in the middle of a collaborative area that has different kinds of loose furniture or lounge seating to create barriers and a little bit of privacy in those kinds of spaces, and create little hubs. You can, as you're planning new spaces, instead of a traditional bench, you can face people outward. You can think about doing a pinwheel design. I'm going to show you another picture here, how the difference between a normal bench and then doing a pinwheel. So this is giving the users the chance, they're not facing each other directly. So this kind of configuration can be very helpful in adding more safety.
And one thing, quick thing in that example is those screens, those sort of U-shaped screens, move with the table. These are height adjustable tables, and so as the table rises, so do the screens. And I think that will give users kind of a sense of comfort as well.
Good point. In this example, this is a new system that we've recently launched called Treehouse, where you can have high surfaces or low surfaces, and people can have a staggered facing or outward facing for the desk orientation. So this is really helpful in giving both privacy and staggered facing to minimize risk. Jan, I'll let you talk to this one. I think we've been
so part of what we're saying here is we can take an existing social collaborative space and potentially mark certain seats as not being used, so that as it does get used, there's automatically distance between things that we've marked as usable. And this is also an example of that sort of grid work that holds those whiteboards being something that helps, again, create space division. And so you have a sense, again, of the boundaries of this space, and makes it easy for people to sort of see how to circulate around it, but also how to protect the users that are using it. And this is a lot of the furniture that we sell in the US, and part of this is the shape themselves help people to feel a little bit separate, as you see in the language on the far left. And then, for example, the small table in the middle is the fact that it's designed the way it is and has sort of the angled edges to it, kind of creates a sense of where am I sitting versus other people. Pam's going to have an example like this. And also you see in the lower right-hand corner, those are all, again, freestanding walls that have been designed, and you can't tell, but there's glass between each of the three booths that, again, help with being able to keep line of sight and enjoy the outdoors, but also that there's a barrier that's cleanable between those booths.
And with the, we talked earlier about global travel coming to a sudden halt and countries with their borders closed. Well, how do we work around that if we can't travel to meetings and see each other? It really makes the whole technology become very, very important for us to be able to communicate in ways like we're doing right now. And it's important to plan that into the office space. Some things you can do are, for instance, having a screen on with a person working from home that's always on. So if two team members need to collaborate together on a daily basis, one could be sitting in the office at this workstation and the other one could be on the screen doing their work, and then they can easily collaborate with an always on situation. This is an idea of using a suite. On the right-hand side, you can see it doesn't have any furniture inside, just a screen. So the idea is you would go in here to do a stand-up meeting, a virtual meeting with someone, and you do your meeting, you stay in the booth 15, 20 minutes, and then you leave again. Or on the left-hand side, you could do the same thing, but maybe put a sofa in it. And the table, you could bring your own table. And I'm going to show you another slide on that in a minute with the concept of bringing your own table. because minimizing sharing and touching is something that is one of the key things we need to think about now as we bring people back to the office. The less people have to share controls and touch the same things, the less they'll be susceptible to picking up germs. So one of the things we're throwing out there is it's something to think about is the idea of having your own table. Everyone has their own table, and then when they go to a meeting, they bring it, they come together as a team, they take it back afterward, and they're not sharing it with anyone else. Or the concept of having a gesture-controlled, height-adjustable workstation. So if you have an environment where you have to share a station that someone else has used previously, if you don't have to touch the controls and you can do it with your app on your phone, it'll be much easier and safer instead of having to touch the controls, those high touch points we want to avoid. And also armless chairs. Leave the chairs off if it's a shared use situation. So I think we have the next poll up.
I think it's the wrap up poll now, but a couple of interesting questions that are now coming up, based on the furniture insights and applications. And that's for, Veena is asking, what are your thoughts on workplace trends? Do you see the panels coming back? And another related question from Sumit is, can temporary partition in between workstations resolve the problem? If yes, what should be the height, if we know?
Wow, I was waiting for that question about height. We get the same question in the States as well, and we have combed much of the CDC material, and I wish I could tell you that there is a recommended height, but I think we just don't know enough about exactly how the people breathing or sneezing or coughing can spread, and so there's even some scientists that say 6 feet isn't far enough, that it's more like 10 or 12 because of the way that the germs can travel if somebody has a pretty aggressive sneeze. And so, it's hard to know whether things can go over the top of whatever height we pick, et cetera. And so I don't have a good answer for you. I think some of this is more about psychology, is if that helps people to feel safer and we practice other really good habits and we make sure people aren't sick when they show up, I think it's a combination of things that is going to keep us safe. I don't think there's a magic panel height. I wish I could tell you that there is.
And are the panels going to come back? Any thoughts on that? Or you don't? We don't know yet.
I don't know that we know yet. I mean, I think they've always served a bit of a purpose to help with power distribution and division and boundary and that sort of thing. But I think there's also, an unconscious bias that it feels sort of permanent. So I think it may have to do as much with the culture of the organization and the image that the company is attempting to promote of, is this sort of a stable, solid, consistent, like say a law firm where you really want to know they've been around, they've got a reputation, they're solid people, they're doing solid kinds of work, so I think it's more about the connotation of the product and less maybe about its utility, because there's lots of other ways to do screening.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, fantastic. I think that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you all. And, as I wrap up, one thing that clearly stood out from the discussion and the questions from the attendees is that, whether people go back to work or continue working from home, the one factor that will really drive a lot of the decisions is the health and wellness of people. All the decisions going forward, will be more human-centric than ever before.
Yeah, and I welcome that. I think that's a great development in a sense. It's a silver lining. If you've heard that expression, it's a silver lining coming out of this situation. Hopefully we will just be more human and real and empathic and accepting of each other's concerns.
Before we ring off, I did want to mention that for anyone who asked a question in the chat that we weren't able to answer, we will follow up on email and answer your questions.
Great. And one other thing, as a wrap up is, so we, what Pam presented on applications and insights, we have India-specific workplace solutions that we've created. So please feel free to get in touch. And a lot of the products that you saw here are also available from our plant in India. So please get in touch with us, and we'll be glad to help you in case you're looking for retrofit solutions for your current workplace or looking for some idea starters in case you plan on doing a new office. So with that, thank you so much, Jan and Pam. I'm so glad you were able to join us despite being in a totally different time zone, and really appreciate your time and your thoughts on this topic. Thank you again to all the attendees, and look forward to seeing all of you again in the future sessions that we hold. Really appreciate it. Thank you, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.